We've been discussing quite a lot about the domestic debt restructuring program. The government has announced plans, certain plans the government has branded as the final plan. And one of the most unpopular decisions that the government has made, of course, is to restructure the EPF and the ETF, the bonds that have been issued to the EPF and ETF. This would obviously result in the pension fund of the working class here in Sri Lanka taking a hit or bearing the brunt for the mistakes that have been made in the past as far as ensuring debt sustainability here in Sri Lanka. To discuss these matters and much more, we've got with us today Mr. Gihan Pathirana, an economist. A very good evening, Mr. Pathirana, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
So there has been a lot of opposition against the EPF and ETF funds being used in this domestic debt optimization program. The government says that this is the best option that is available to us. There has been very limited discussions, at least with trade unions and generally the people who are really affected by this, who are working class of Sri Lanka, mostly in the private sector of the country. Now, one can argue and say that the government really didn't have time to discuss these matters with trade unions and the people who are really affected, given the severity of the economic crisis that Sri Lanka was facing, and also historically knowing that discussions with trade unions don't go too well and they don't agree or compromise on their stance too often. But my question to you really is this the best possible way that the domestic debt optimization program in Sri Lanka could be done?
No, absolutely no. Well, especially given that there are so many other alternatives that they could have actually considered when it comes to bringing down the debt burden, especially the domestic debt burden, and not just the domestic debt burden, even the foreign debt burden. So we have, as a group of trade unionists and also civil representatives, have actually come up with a few alternatives which would actually give a greater scope and greater relief to the government in terms of reducing the debt burden, other than slashing the only savings of the working class or the working people of the country after they actually retire from work. And this is obviously, we all know that this is the only savings and only source of funds that they have once they stop working, once they retire. And for the most of the working people, that is their only relief, or that is the only source of funds they have to the till the rest of their lives. So now the government has exclusively targeted these funds, while there are so many other options. For instance, now I'll just make a small comparison. Now recently or day before, Governor Nandalal said now, including us and certain other parties, have been complaining or have been pointing out that around 45% of the total returns to the fund in the next 16 years will be slashed if this DDR program is
45%.
45%, minimum of 45% of the next 16 years. The value will be slashed if the DDR is enacted, because this happens in few fronts. One, on the interest rate reduction and the compounding rate which is affected, and on the other hand we have to take the terminal value of the interest rate loss. We have to put that together, and that comes to 45% of the.
But I think one of the main arguments that a lot of the leaders in Sri Lanka, or politicians, people in parliament who raise their hands in favor of this proposal, are saying is the fact that usually when it comes to the EPF, and let's take an average person, how will that average person be affected by it? They build up this argument that if there's a person working in the private sector contributing to the EPF and ETF, come his retirement time, he will be able to withdraw the full amount of money that is due to him. There will be no reduction. People who are due to retire maybe in a month's time, 2 months' time, a year, 2 years, there will be no reduction in the amount of money that he receives at the end of his working period, at the point of retirement. So what they're trying to say is that, look here, we have a lot of money here in this fund, and that money is being, invested in bonds and rolled over and over. So let's use this money, because that is the best way that we can have less of an impact on the economy of Sri Lanka in conducting this domestic debt optimization? And in the end, what's the harm? A working person who contributes to the EPF will get the amount that he is due to receive at the end of retirement without any deductions.
Yeah, but that is not the case. Now, what they mean by this, the amount that you contribute will be returned to you, is not how you actually look at when it comes to a retirement fund and the amount of funds that you actually withdraw at the point of retirement. Now, there is a interest component for your whatever the savings that you actually contribute on a monthly basis. Now, there is no deduction from the fund from your monthly contribution. That is quite clear, but that is not the issue here. The income to your fund actually accumulates over time through the compounding rate of interest. Now, when this interest will be brought down significantly due to the DDR that has been proposed. If I be more clear, now the central bank has clearly proposed they are going to reduce 0.1% of the GDP from the interest. That is 1,000th of the total national income reduced from your interest. And then on the other hand, 0.4% the principal payments that are when the bond is maturing, that amount is extended over a period of 16 years. There are maturities also that are happening, but still, then again the total 0.5% of the GDP will happen in the next 16 years throughout. Now, what we need to keep in mind is that GDP is something that is growing each year. So, what accrues under this 0.5% will also increase at the same rate. So, the same amount, the impact will be shown by that 0.5% on the fund itself. So, when you are saying, look here, you are contributing some amount, nobody is going to slash that. What we need to look at is the total returns you would get without the DDR and the total returns you would get after the DDR. So, say
so
for instance,
how much is the difference like? I mean,
yes, say the difference is huge. Now, if say you are about to receive something like 10 million after in 2038
before DDR.
Yes, before DDR, if you are to receive around 10 million rupees, your net return, the funds you could actually withdraw before tax. Now, there is a tax you have to pay when you are withdrawing at the point of withdrawal also. Before that tax, that would go down to somewhere around 6.3 million. So
let's just forget the tax component just to make it easier for our viewers to understand.
Right.
So, what you're saying is,
so that's around 47% reduction from the total fund.
So what you're saying is somewhere in 2018, if a person is waiting to 2038, if someone is waiting to retire in 2038 and he is due to receive 10 million rupees before DDR. After the DDR, he will only be receiving 6.7 million.
6.3, somewhere around that. That is around 47%. From the fund has been deducted, but that doesn't mean they will be slashing your contributions.
I understand.
The slashing will come through the reduction in the rate of return you will be getting, net rate of return. And it is the net rate of return which actually accumulates your fund, not your monthly contributions.
So, Mr. Pathirana, do you think that the general public as a whole, especially the working class in Sri Lanka, are really aware of these implications?
I would say no, because for many reasons. Because on one hand, we see the opposition parties are not educating the public, and even the trade unions and even the economists have not been educated. Now, recently we have been seeing few of them like being very active in the parliament and so on, complaining about how unjust and undemocratic this process is, especially exclusively targeting the EPF and the ETF. When there is other more lucrative options, for instance, the tax evasion. The tax evasion itself is much greater than the reduction in the debt burden which the central bank is actually expecting. The amount of taxes that they can actually reclaim and that has been evaded would give them a benefit much greater than the EPF reduction, what they expect from the EPF reduction. Because if we take now, when we were actually trying to convey this message, central bank governor completely obstructed us and never gave us the chance, saying that this is not our this is completely out of their purview.
You're speaking about the discussion that
yes,
was held
recently
with the governor of the central bank.
Exactly. So, but that argument itself is quite fraudulent, because if you take the Montreal Act, the first condition in the Montreal Act is that the central bank is bound to maintain the stability of the economy, and whatever processes that are actually happening, which are actually endangering the stability, economic stability, central bank has the responsibility in intervening. That's one thing. And even beyond that, if you take the DDR proposal, the 30% tax have been proposed by the central bank. So while they are saying not to talk about the taxes and so on with the central bank itself actually proposed the 30% tax instead of the DDR. If you are participating in the DDR, you will be excluded from the 30% tax, but if you refuse to participate, you will be taxed 30%. That is the condition which the central bank itself proposed. And beyond that, there have been so many other tax proposals, how to expand the tax net and so on in that proposal, which are made by the central bank. So that is clearly in their mandate to provide advocacy to the government in terms of the tax revenue and so on. So that is a clear option which they had, other than slashing the funds of the EPF and ETF, because if you take the 900 billion value, you have to take the present value of that.
But Mr. Pathirana, let me pose this question to you this way now. The first question that I asked you was, is this really the best way forward? And you said, no, this is definitely not the best way. There are better ways that would impact the people who are the subject of concern here, because they are the innocent party. They weren't the people who made Sri Lanka unsustainable as far as the debt is concerned. So it's not the best option. But what if I ask you, is this the easiest option that the government has?
Well, you have to look at the point of view, you have to look at this issue from the point of view of what is just and what is actually fair. And as you correctly mentioned, the working people of this country has nothing to do with this crisis, and they are not they are not the agents of this crisis. And there are many parties, including the corruption in the government, including certain business conglomerates that have been assisting that process, who are actually at the heart of this economic collapse. So then when you are trying to come up with solutions to the debt crisis that certain parties have actually caused, then you have to put the burden of the crisis onto their shoulders, not onto the working people who have been actually keeping the economy going, keeping the people of this country alive.
Mr. Pathirana, when I said the easiest option for the government, I meant, see, if the government were to conduct, slash the debt of foreign creditors a little bit higher to ensure that the economy is stable, because whatever the debt that is slashed, that also has to be sufficient. Sri Lanka has to be able to pay the amount that it is promising now, because we've already defaulted on our debt. So that involves discussion with foreign creditors, restructuring debt of banks and other private entities would also require a certain level of discussion. And of course, as you said, there are certain conglomerates that are involved in this matter, very close to politicians. They won't be very happy, and the politicians will have to take a little bit of a hit for that. So the EPF ETF are two funds, they're standing. The people who are actually benefiting from it, contributing to it, who are members of the fund, are not represented there. They have no voice.
Absolutely.
There is no need for discussions. All it takes is the slash of a pen.
Exactly. No, I completely agree. But then again, there are methods which could be even more easier if they have the will and the need to do it. Now, for instance, if you take the audit report produced by the former Auditor General. Now, all these reports have been already done. So the government doesn't need to put their additional effort to bring up an audit and so on, because in 2017 he clearly mentioned when our foreign debt was 8 trillion rupees, only 2 trillion rupees is remaining in the country in the form of assets. So 6 trillion is missing, and that 6 trillion is like 15 times greater than what they are going to slash from the EPF. So obviously then they can take action. Like for now, if that debt is not used in the best interest of the public, the international law and the US law both states that it is in the power of the existing government to actually declare that debt as odious debt, and that amount of debt does not need to be the current government is not obliged to pay that debt, because they can go to international courts and then argue. And the burden of proof actually lies with the creditor, not with the borrower, when you have clear evidences of gross corruption and mismanagement happening in terms of foreign debt. So these studies and audits have been already done. It's just a matter of pursuing on that path, using that data to build up a case in the international courts that, look here, this amount of debt has been already been audited and they have been clarified as being not used in the most productive way for the public. So that is one way, one clear way of going about this thing, demanding this as odious debt. So and then of course I keep on repeating this, because tax evasion is is equally large. Now if you take the current value of that tax evasion, it should be over 2 trillion, because there is borrowed funds by the government as a result of tax evasion. So which needs to be repaid with interest, and so you have to compound that and you take the present value. So you take the 2 trillion and then take the value of that in next 16 years, that comes to around 7.9 trillion when you compound that with a 9% interest rate. So you see how huge these numbers are. So if you these are very easy things to do, because inland revenue have already got the data where the evasion had been taking place, and then central bank has the data. If these people own bonds, they can actually cancel these bonds who have, like there is clear evidence of tax evasion, and if that volume exceeds that amount of bonds these people hold, they can actually take over their deposits, which would have zero impact on the banking sector, because it's a transfer of ownership, not there is no withdrawal of funds.
Right.
So zero impact on these three options alone exceeds more, I mean, in multiple times in terms of if you consider what the impact on the EPF is. So what we have calculated.
In your view, out of these options that are available,
so but these are political decisions.
What would be the more drastic decision? I mean, slashing the EPF ETF, or going down the path that you proposed? What would be the more drastic decision?
I should say the most unjust and undemocratic decision is slashing the EPF and ETF, because.
But what would be the most drastic?
What do you mean by drastic?
I mean, unexpected, that would probably cause a bit of, a shift in the powers that be.
Well, I think all those three measures would actually challenge the status quo, because it would actually it would demand sort of challenge to the powers who are holding that capital and who are actually accumulated that capital in a corrupt way, and that has actually contributed to the crisis that we are facing. So obviously all these measures would impact the people who are actually responsible to the crisis. Now what we are seeing is the exact opposite. The people who are responsible to the crisis are actually accumulating more and more profits as a result of the crisis. If I give a small example, now we know, now even I think Dr. Harsha De Silva, now after we been over and over again have been trying to get this message across that, look here, the bonds that were issued last year, 25%, 30% with interest yields, were mostly bought up by the corporate sector, or in the banking, the non-banking finance sector, and the conglomerates and the individuals. EPF and ETF altogether bought only 21% of the total bonds that were issued last year, and even out of that, the most high yielding ones were entirely bought up by these people. Now, for instance, yesterday I remember Harsha De Silva saying there was a bond issued at some 33% yield, 94% of it was bought by those people, the banks, the non-banks, King Financial Sector, the corporates and so on.
So this is of course the premium on the risk that they are taking.
Absolutely, the premium meaning they are taking, yes, there is a risk, but then they are being guaranteed by the government, and they have, now in that case then the entire spectrum of investors should be taking it evenly. Now the EPF and ETF have bought only 6% of the highest yielding bonds. Now they are targeting the EPF ETF where they have accumulated, where they have the lowest yielding bonds, and they are slashing their income, whereas you are leaving those people untouched, right. So now what happens as a result of that? It's not just they are yielding 33% for the next 10 years. Now they have been getting thumping capital gains out of the current conditions, because we know that the interest rates have fallen. Because the central bank brought it down with the policy rates being slashed somewhere around 400 to 500 basis points, and the price level has not continued to increase, because the price levels are already sky high. You can't expect the prices to go even up, right. So then now they are boasting that the inflation has come down, but that's a complete misunderstanding. The price levels, as you see, are completely like exceedingly high compared to the incomes that average people are making. So with the interest rates coming down, what we see is the price of those bonds doubling. So these people can make huge gains, huge capital gains up to 100 to 150% in a matter of weeks or in a matter of few months. So and they have been left, I mean, completely been untouched, and they have allowed them to make those humongous profits while slashing the only savings which the workers have after their retirement. This is like the message they are giving is, we don't care whether you survive after you work, but until you are 55 we will get work out of you, and whether you survive after that is up to you. It's the government does not mind whether you survive or not, whereas where the people who are actually making the most out of this are allowed to make even more out of these conditions. So I see this is completely unjust and undemocratic. So and as we know, people don't exactly see this happening, because these things happen in financial markets, and most of us are not aware of it. So it is up to the people who have some background about this, even in the political parties, let's say economists, trade unions, and people with background in finance, to actually educate the public. Look here, this is what is going on. They have been ripping you off for ages now.
But Mr. Pathirana, now we're in the final few minutes of the show, so right. I'd like to draw your attention a little bit to what's really happening in the country right now. Next year is slated to be an election year. I know we're already in an election period. Right. However, the election is not taking place. It's been postponed indefinitely. However, even the governing parties, the president to a certain degree has hinted that next year will be an election year. And now we're receiving reports about certain budgetary reliefs at the upcoming appropriation bill. And also, we can see that political parties are now prepping for an election. You see the age-old arguments of, this individual was the savior of the nation, and you also get certain political parties trying to push a racist agenda, right, and try to secure some seats in that way. Do you think that these, age-old political tricks that mainly divide and conquer, that political parties have been using for so long to stay in power, right, and to keep the people in check, will succeed again at a time when people are suffering financially so much? Do you think that will overshadow again?
I think your question is whether they will play the racial card to.
No, my question is, they will definitely. There will be individuals who will play that card. I mean, I'm willing to bet. I'm willing to bet that they will happen.
Whether the public would.
Yes, caught up in your experience, judging by the sentiment among the general public, do you think that kind of an argument or an agenda will trump the real issues that the people are facing, which are economical, financial?
Yeah, right now, if you look at the public opinion and how it's been handled right now, I don't think that would have a major impact on how people would decide at the polling booth, especially because what we know, I mean, this is not the historical experience we see elsewhere. We see that whenever there is an economic crisis, forces of fascism and racism and all this divisive politics being propped up. Let's take the history of Europe and so on. This has been very clear. But what is very unique about Sri Lanka's situation right now is that the entire collapse happened under a fascist, or let me call it a very explicitly call it a very racist leadership and a racist establishment, and under the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime. So the crisis exactly happened at a point when the racial sentiments were at its peak, and so now so the responsibility of the crisis was, in a way, I think the public sort of realized that these divisive politics was also at the heart of the collapse, not just the financial and the corruption that we have been seeing. So as a result, I don't see the public getting so much attracted to this divisive rhetoric that we would expect during an election period, and therefore I would say that at this time public would definitely focus more on the real issues. There are economic and financial issues, and basically the collapse of the entire social fabric that we are seeing around. The education, even the health sector is collapsing. We know even at this rate of collapse, we see like openly corruption is going on in the health sector. That's what we've been seeing at this no confidence motion against the health minister. So these things are openly happening still, even under this sort of tremendous collapse of the entire social network in the country. So I am pretty confident that in the next election, people would actually give priority to more their real socio-economic issues, and they would use this election to give a mandate based on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gihan Pathirana, economist, for joining us on our show and clarifying, of course, these very complicated economic unfoldings that are taking place here in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.